Hello, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to this week's Timeline. We're going to break down and analyse the Umayyad period. Muawiyah is somebody who most Muslims are aware of as the ruler after the four rightly guided caliphs, and of course the rule of Imam Hassan alayhi salam as well is overlapping with the period of Muawiyah in Damascus. Today I have with me Sheikh Amin Evans, who's going to enlighten us a little further about the circumstances, the historical perspective, the cultural perspective, the economic, political shenanigans that were going on during this period, and what ultimately led to the emergence of effectively a temporal power which didn't seem to have entirely a handle on esoteric Islam, many would argue. Sheikh Amin, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me, Mosa.
Sheikh, a lot of our focus is ultimately going to be towards why Karbala had to happen and why Imam Hussein alayhi salam, particularly in Islamic history, had to make the sacrifice he did. And it could well be argued that the period of Muawiyah in Damascus was central to forming the climate and circumstances that would lead to the necessity of the sacrifice of Imam Hussein alayhi salam in Karbala. And we touched previously on the Umayyad methodology of ruling in Damascus. So take me back to Damascus again, but we'll also try to see what's happening in Mecca, Medina, and perhaps Kufa, just to give us a feel of the Islamic Empire at that time. But let's look at the political aspects that period of Muawiyah in Damascus brought forth, basically.
Muawiyah isn't a king in what we in the West would consider like a medieval king. He doesn't have an absolute authority. He depends upon the authority of tribal factions, and he plays them off against each other. He becomes a supreme leader because he allies people better than anyone else at the period. And he does this with gifts, what we might call bribes, severe punishments, but also, to a large extent, flattery. He's ready to give people appointments that they're not worthy of, and great status, lots of attention at court. So he spends most of his time pulling the reins of these different efforts to keep his authority together. It's not a case that people just go, Muawiyah is the leader. Everybody is bought and bribed in one way or another, and he sits at the head of this rather shaky pile. And it's important to remember that the Umayyad rulership isn't that secure at this period. It's under threat on its borders. The Romans, the Byzantines are attacking. There's still warfare in the east. There's trouble in Egypt. All this is going on throughout the early period, and rulers have to maintain the economy, maintain an army at home, do their internal diplomacy, and try to win wars and new lands on the borders.
So let me untangle this. It's a complex web because Muawiyah, of course, was appointed very early on in the Islamic rule. So he's been around for 20 years or so, perhaps prior to the coming to the Caliphate of Imam Ali al-Islam, certainly, and probably during the period of Umar's Caliphate. So he's given the patronage of some of the early caliphs, and he has their confidence, and he rules in this Damascene region with what you describe as an element of gift giving and bribery, and he builds up quite dexterously this alliance of previously Byzantine noblemen, or were they still there? Did they all run away? Did all the Byzantines who had been there escape, and were all the masses now immediately converted to Islam? Was that the fact or not?
No, they didn't run away, and they weren't converted to Islam. Quite sensibly, the existing structures were adopted as Islam moved into that area. And Syria itself was divided in half. The western side had been under Byzantine rule, and the eastern half had been under Persian administration. And so two styles of governance were in existence there, and both of these were fused into the Islamic rule, the Umayyad rule. The fact that Muawiyah had been there so long, in the whole of that period, he's the longest serving ruler or governor. He took over armies that were disciplined, and disciplined in two ways. The Roman army was a paid professional army. They were used to doing their duty and slaughtering everybody in front of them without questioning orders. So Muawiyah took those over. The Persian army was driven by an intense nationalistic pride and belief in their warrior caste. They were mainly Zoroastrian, and it was seen as being a good Zoroastrian to be a good soldier, and being loyal to the state was part of their religion. So they obeyed a ruler almost unthinkingly. You could compare them to sort of the Yakuza of Japanese gangsterism, you know, the samurai sort of spirit, that their life was warfare for their king, for their religion. Muawiyah took over these almost robotic forces, and we have to remember that the Arab forces that fought them were neither democratic nor dictatorial. They were loose alliances of people related by blood or pledges and tribal and clan promises. So, and generals were appointed rather like Red Indian chiefs. You know, it would be me sort of going, well, Mohsin, you fought a few times. Take command of 3,000 men. With no thought of, can this person command 3,000 men? Of course, in your case, there's no doubt. Or are they a good strategist? It was just, 50 men owe their allegiance to you, so that'll be the central command unit. You take command. And so there was no actual military, as we would understand the term, in the Arab armies. But in the Persian and the Byzantine armies, they were dedicated soldiers. And this is what gave Muawiyah the strength to negotiate with other people, that he did have a core army that was probably unmatched at that period. But, and this is where it gets complex again, the loyalty of many of the groups of these soldiers was not to Muawiyah or to the Caliphate, but to tribal leaders within the ruling caste. They became the clients, the Muwali, of the tribes. Banu Tamim had a lot of Persian cavalrymen. And of course we come across those later on the field of Karbala. And other groups. So he had to still talk to the other tribal leaders to weld back together this killing machine that he had inherited from the previous empires. However, by the time Imam Ali alayhi salam finally gets the caliphate, Muawiyah has had more than 20 years of pocketing the income of Syria and Egypt. Of course, by then he's taken control of Egypt. A massive income. Syria was the grain bowl of the region. not many dates in Syria, but lots of grain and other materials and trade routes. While he was fighting the Byzantines and the Persians, he was still trading with them very profitably. And so he's immensely rich. He's got a very powerful core army, used to what at the period is total war. They're not fighting by Islamic rules, you know, women, children and fruit trees can go in peace. They destroy everything in front of them. And so who can remove Muawiyah is the real question at the time. He is the superpower in that region.
So when Imam Ali al-Islam arrives back on the scene, it's quite clear that there's a huge task in even bringing him to book. And that's why Muawiyah stands up and plays the game of saying, well, I don't want to accept this caliphate, makes on the premise that Uthman's, the Caliph Uthman's death wasn't being dealt with justly in his eyes. But that was just a pretext, a deliberate desire to actually show his own credentials as the wannabe caliph, if you like.
Well, yes, he was trying to show that really he was the one chosen by God, that he was the voice of justice and truth. And for all of us who've lived through the 20th and the early 21st century, we expect our politicians to make these claims, and we're quite aware that they're all telling us lies. And we try to choose the one who makes our lives the most comfortable. Now, Muawiyah made the lives very comfortable for the powerful men in and around his court. And so they still supported him. The fact that he'd sort of kill one or two of them occasionally didn't really matter. It's that herding instinct. You know, if you all herd together, one or two will get killed, but it probably won't be me. This was the sort of attitude, and often is around brutal dictators or vicious leaders.
And he's obviously then able to manipulate, because by the time Imam Ali al-Islam's name comes up in Syria or in the regions, he's been effectively off the Islamic imperial scene and probably been restricted by and large to maybe Medina and the environs of the original explosion of Islam. So nobody in the Syrian get-up, nobody in the Byzantine world would have known of the exploits of Ali al-Islam. They wouldn't really have known of his chivalry, of his honor, of his values. They were just primarily linked to Muawiyah through the financial gifts and patronage that he provided, and a stability of government. Now, I want to balance this up, that on the one hand, Muawiyah was the benefactor of huge amounts of wealth within Syria, but what did the Baytul Mal, if you do know about that, what did, say, the Caliphate, the central Caliphate, have to do with supporting him as well? Because clearly he would have been underwritten by the Caliph, which would have given him even more wealth and perhaps power.
Well, in actual fact, he wasn't really underwritten at all. The wealth of Syria was such that it was sending money to Medina. It was paying for the divan system that Hazrat Umar set up. This was an open-ended pension. Now the problem is that the gold produced in the around Mecca was sufficient for trade. The big trade for them was sending gold, powdered gold north and bullion bars, and wine coming back, and then they re-exported the wine to other regions and making a profit on this trade and converting their gold dust into Roman and Syrian and Persian coinage at another advantage trade. This is why where the Quran refers to your trade with these regions, that it was this was the trade that the Meccan Arabs were really concerned about. This was their big earner, was the import and re-export of wine for Arabian gold. And it was extremely wealthy, but it wasn't wealthy enough to support a National Health Service with full benefits. When you think of the Divan, more money is spent out in pensions than they can produce in the region. And this means that the provinces have to contribute to keep paying the pensions. It also meant that you had to keep trying to expand the land so you could get war booty. Hence the repeated attempts by the Kufans to conquer Khorasan, because then that money would have flowed back and paid their pensions and given them a bonus of the fight. So the whole economy in that post-prophetic period, from Umar's reign onwards, when the Divan is established, it has to expand. It has to become an expanding military empire. And we can put that squarely on the shoulders of Hazrat Umar. He's changed the character. I'm not saying he did it deliberately, but his actions led to this.
Well, that's fascinating, because you've brought in now the undercurrent, which I want to discuss. We've painted a picture of how temporal power was being maintained, how the economy was being maintained, and how Muawiyah was secured in power during that early period, during the Caliphate, but then subsequently how he obviously then continued to maintain that power. Coming back to this shift, from what I try to think about as the esoteric objective of Islam and the exoteric objective of temporal rulers, it could be argued that gradually or very quickly Muslim leadership begins to shift from the essence of what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ intended as a ruler, that it's questionable to regard the Prophet as someone who was actually coming to power and ruling for the sake of taking over land. I mean, certainly it would be difficult to argue that the Prophet, in any of his warfare, in any of his tactics, any of his policies, was starting with the intention of appropriating land. It seems that during the early Caliphate period, that's one obvious shift. You also talk about this other shift in terms of the way that the Baytul Mal was being served, that this relationship with the outer territories is crucial. Is this a manifestation of that split which takes place at Saqifa, in which certain people push for a governance based on man-made rules, based on perhaps, many people in Islamic history would argue, non-esoteric thinking? And on the other hand, would you say it was clear-cut at that time that there were groups of individuals, thinkers and esoterics, who would have wanted something quite different and would have been quite worried about this trend of economically land imperial Islam that seemed to have taken root?
Yes, well, I think in a traditional, the sort of the Maulana discourse, which we all accept, we're presented with the Caliphate and the Qurayshite tribal nobility trying to hang on to power for power's sake. There's very little discussion of the economics. When it said, well, what will they change? You know, what would Ali alayhi salam have changed? You know, there are discussions about, oh, he'd returned Fadak to the Hashemite family. He'd have reinforced the permissibility of the two mortars, a lot of things. But are these anything to fight to hold an empire over? Yeah, I don't think so. There wasn't that hot theological debate where people were trying to kill each other over theological points. There are later on in Baghdad. People do get that worked up, but not at that time in Medina. What you have got at that period is the threat that the Hashemites, led by Ali alayhi salam, would return to the financial structure and the judgments as carried out in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, which would have meant the distinctions in the divan, where the oldest or the first companions get paid much more than the next rank, and so on. What if that was swept away? By now, some of the people who'd been the poorest of companions are some of the wealthiest men in Medina and Mecca. Now, do you vote for the generous liberal, or do you vote for the mean conservative who's going to keep the money in your pocket? And we see it all the time, that people do not support a good man because their best self-interest is served by voting for a badly motivated politician. And this is what we see happening in Medina, in Saqifa. But there's another element there. There's an hadith. I can't give you a reference. I forget which book I've read it in.
We'll find it later. Thank you.
Of Hazrat Umar talking to some of his companions, and he's setting up the shura for Saqifa and saying who should be at it. And he says, whatever they do, they must not appoint Muawiyah because he is ambitious to be the caliph. Now, whether this is a later addition to try and whitewash Umar, or whether it's a truthful account of what happened then, it shows that in that period before or after Saqifa, the discussion wasn't just about why was Ali blocked, but there were other reasons being discussed. And obviously the biggest driving force for not giving Ali the caliphate was to keep the divan system. Remember that one of the stipulations they add on is that whoever becomes the caliph must continue the rulings of Abu Bakr and Umar. Now, what had they done that was so objectionable? According to the hadith record in Muwatta and Bukhari.
Because Imam Ali alayhi salam, of course, rejects this. He says, I wouldn't carry on with what they do. I would go back to what the Prophet does.
Yeah. And the biggest thing in that is the divan. But, there's evidence that some of the things that are now said to have been definitely done by Umar or by Abu Bakr were in actual fact doubtful at the time. We have the case of report of Hazrat Uthman, when he's fairly new in the caliphal job, saying, "Oh, how I wish that Umar ibn al-Khattab had managed to ban the muta because it causes so many arguments," words to that effect. So that in actual fact, we say that Umar banned the muta marriage, but it seems it was still being practiced in the time of Uthman, so the ban wasn't that binding. So what was binding? The most binding force in the universe. Not the dark force, but the force of gold in your pocket. And this seems to me to be the big driving force, that it's making big business.
That's at the centre of decision making.
And he doesn't want somebody with any heart in the leadership position.
So an esoteric, good-hearted leadership would have done away with this diwan system, would have restructured it to being more prophetically linked. It's also important to discuss riba and the usury system, because one of the strongest arguments is, during the changes that took place of the Prophet's period is that economic destruction of Mecca was one of the major fears of the Quraysh when the Prophet says, take down these idols, and with his message. They're not so worried about him believing in the one God. It's more that he's going to tear down these other gods and this center of economical wealth, which they equated with the gods, who provided all sorts of cultures and introduction of other foreigners. That was a wealth oriented. So there was that one element of destroying Mecca's kind of centrality economically there. But then he also comes up with the destruction of usury as practiced by the Quraysh at that time. Both of those are issues I'd like you to deal with.
Yeah. Well, dealing with the Kaaba, you know, there's a lot of talk by alleged historians, and I'm thinking of Patricia Kroner and her people who say, you know, Mecca wasn't a big trading centre before the Islamic period, and it's just the Islamic people have just made it this. Well, this is nonsense actually on the archaeological record, because the original footprint of the Kaaba, including the Hatim, is the bullet-shaped, the U-shaped structure that is used for temple sanctuaries at the crossroads of major trading centres throughout Palestine and Arabia. There are only a few of them that we know of, but you see the signs, the little pavilions within an area for circumambulation. So the age of the Kaaba is immensely old, as the early Islamic scholars said, and the archaeology proves that. It's going back at least to the early Bronze Age, this style of build structure and sanctuary. But it becomes used in the period before Islam as something like a cross between, I don't know, what's the big exhibition centre in London now? It used to be Olympia. It is still Olympia.
Yeah.
I live in
Earl's Court.
I live up
Excel.
north in the country. It was a cross between that and Wembley Stadium. So everybody went there doing deals, and they all brought their own gods, stuck them in there and said, we're trading brothers. And they circumambulated together and struck deals. The Quraysh were making money selling them water and feeding them during this period. So they were all rubbing along, doing business, not really worried too much about religion. It was just convenient. With Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, of course, religion reasserts its importance, and moral action does as well. But the reference to the trade being taken away from the Quraysh, their wine trade turns the gold, which is useless to them, into commodities that they can use. And so the threat of being a teetotal society is for many of them the threat of bankruptcy. And of course a whole economic package has to be developed to say this will only affect the unjust people. And so in the injustice package, of course, riba is an injustice. And what's referred to there isn't the sort of the 10 or 15% or 20% charges. We're talking the sort of, it's the payday loan of the age, where if you borrow a couple of pounds at the start of the year, you owe thousands. By the end of the year, it doubles repeatedly in a compound interest of doubling. So if you borrow money and guarantee your harvest at that value, then you have to pay double your harvest back at the end of the year, so you have to borrow again. This is a form of inflationary loaning and repaying, and it destroys confidence and traps people in poverty, because the food they grow never brings them any comfort. It will barely pay what they owe, and they'll only have enough left to get another loan so that they can survive the year to pay off the next loan the next year. That's forbidden. What do these things do to society? If all the money is concentrated in the hands of a few merchants, and they are removing all the other available wealth by offering loans at usurious rates, you have masses of poor, frightened, hungry people who are generally, I would suggest, quite angry about not being able to live very well. So what we see in Islam is a forbiddance on these causes of discord, and then through the fundings of zakat and khums, backed up by sadaqah, we see attempts to level out, reduce the gap between rich and poor, to try and build a more harmonious society. When these are all applied together, we see that money, the opportunity to make wealth, is being placed in the hands of everyone. The means of production are being distributed amongst the people who actually do the productive work. We shouldn't confuse this with communism. This isn't everybody gets a share in the production, but the people who can do the work, who own the farms, can make the profits, not merchants who aren't working. At the same time, their wealth becomes taxed in a voluntary system where they pay their khums and they pay their zakat appropriately, and this is used for people who have no income. At the same time, we're getting hadith like the man who was begging and he's given an axe or a sickle and told, go and cut firewood, then you can feed yourself every day. It took Oxfam another 1400 years to think up something like that. So we've got projects to put work in people's hands, to distribute sufficient money for them to survive at some level of above subsistence, and we've got attempts to reduce the gap between rich and poor. And all of this is to try and produce this harmonious community.
Let me tie this now, having given us a wonderful picture of now Medina, because we talked about Damascus and you brought me back to Medina, and we've gone to the origins of where the system began during the Prophet's time now. You talked about the Diwan system that emerges from this anti-riba, rich getting richer and exploitation. But did the Diwan system begin to undermine this sense of equality?
Well, this is exactly the point, that when the large booty from the expanding empire and the income from territories that had become Islamic or Muslim, there's a massive wealth coming in, and the people at the top say, well, we should get more of this. We were the first companions. We gave up our wealth when we were in Mecca. Shouldn't we now be compensated for what we used to get? Shouldn't we be paid for the effort we put in fighting and investing in the Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him? And since they're all in charge, it's a bit like when the House of Parliament votes for a pay rise. You know, they don't vote on other people's pay, they vote on their own pay. And of course, they always get the rise that can be afforded. And so the people who are holding the money vote that they should take the lion's share, and then the people who they recruited get a bit less, and so on. This is completely against the idea of distribution and reduction of wealth differentials. This increases wealth differentials, creates a gap that isn't filled by a middle class. There's very rich merchants and a big gap between them, and then below them somewhere there's poor people, slaves, and generally women, because this now is becoming the system that is suitable.
So why I'm going to link this is to Umayyads and Damascus, is that it seems that if you've begun to undermine the prophetic system in Medina at the centre of governance in the original caliphates, clearly it gives a green light to the likes of Muawiyah, who are also watching this undermining of the Diwan system, of the prophetic system. They can take it a little bit further. So does riba, for instance, ever come back into operation by backdoor means, or do they actually stick to that, at least that rule? Do the Umayyads, for instance, stick to keeping riba out?
They introduced banking and interest, and of course the letters of trade and bank drafts are Islamic inventions from the Umayyad and the Abbasids, because they were trading over immense distances. You couldn't carry bags of gold, well, not in any safety, the distances that they did business. So they would send a letter from one merchant to another, pay the bearer upon presentation £1 of gold. Don't try it at our banks, they'll laugh at you. So they invented the banknote, in effect. It's an Islamic invention, and it doesn't cause inflation. We'll have phone calls about that one. The bankers are mainly Christians, again, because as the Christians had said in their case, that they could take and pay interest to Jews, so Jews were bankers in Europe. So the Muslims in the Umayyad court said, well, we can pay and receive interest from Christians. So they became the bankers to the Umayyad court. So during the early Umayyad period, we do see periods of raging inflation, social disorder, and several attempts at monetary reform to try and control this, despite all the currency being backed by gold and silver. It's no guarantee, if you've got a good coin, the metal it's made of, it's still just a token of cash value.
But is this in compliance with prophetic Islamic trading?
Well, not at all, because it says do not exchange like weights of precious metals. You know, you can't exchange £1 of gold for a pound's worth of gold ore, for instance. You shouldn't exchange a cheap wheat for an expensive wheat. These are the currencies at the time. And if you say that a pound of gold is actually worth 1.5 pounds of gold, you've actually caused inflation. Your gold is actually worth less.
To the layperson, this would be quite interesting, because what we're saying is that very early on in Islam, there's an undermining of the economic vision that the Prophet perhaps would have laid out.
Yes,
by Muslims.
Yeah, the anti-inflationary measures are skirted around and flaunted by using agents of other religions. The land becomes a source of revenue for the caliph, so he charges kharij on it. He's never owned this land, but he passes a law that he taxes the land and the produce from the land. So in effect, he replaces the merchant as the leech on the back of the low-level farmer.
I'm looking at the Ahlul Bayt and the continued viewing of this undermining of the prophetic line economically, and I would have thought that they were raising objections. But when you have a temporal power which is as great as theirs, say let's concentrate back on Muawiyah again, you have this undermining of Islamic economics which is consolidated by him. But the good guys, the esoterically inclined Muslims, would probably be powerless to change that system because it's been established, and those new Muslims who'd arrived into the faith just follow whatever the caliphate is ordering.
They do, and not only the good guys, some of the guys who've been there a long time. When, for instance, Abdullah ibn Umar gives bay'ah to Ziyad, no, jump forward a bit.
Yeah.
When he goes home, he bursts into tears in shame and says, you know, what have I done giving bay'ah to a man like that? And one of his family members says, don't worry, today you've saved your whole clan. He's kept them in the divan structure. He's kept their income and their security. So this is very important in the thinking around there. What are they going to do for a living if they don't get the divan money? Well, they'd have to work. It's unthinkable. You know, they're aristocrats by now. They can't work. And so all these forces are working against anyone saying, is this right? Think of the whistleblowers in the banking system. What happens to them? You know, they're chased all over the world. You know, just for saying, you know, somebody made an excess profit. And this is what was being done, and this is what really drove inflation at that time, and it's what drives inflation today. It's not what you pay workers that drives inflation. It's how much you undermine the value of your money by self-centered economic policy.
Okay, let's as we're focusing on the economy, money lending. In the background, was usury still going on? Was there money lending to the Caliph going on? Were there money lenders as such lurking in the Muslim empire?
Yes, the money lending was being carried out, as I say, by mainly Christian bankers.
And it was allowed by the Caliphate?
And the Caliphate allowed it. They said, you know, they're Christians, our laws don't apply. Of course, they conveniently ignored the fact that in both the Jewish and the Christian codes, usury is forbidden, just the same. But, you know, what's a law or two between friends, you know, when business is involved? And so we've got all these forces undermining the stability of people and their sense of security. You can also add to that there was no fixed exchange rate between the dinar and the dirham. So you got different numbers and different weights of both coins. Plus, even if you got the same weight and in both coins, there was no fixed exchange rate between the two. So you couldn't. You can imagine the chaos in pricing and working out how to pay in silver or gold. So the opportunity for usurious transactions, even in the coinage, you could say, I'm going to lend you 5 dinars from such and such district, but I want you to pay me back 7 from another district, which could mean you could be asking back for 3 times as much weight of gold. Now that's usurious.
Well, this is all a countercultural narrative, a counter-economic narrative in a way, because many Muslims today will look back on that period of Islam, of Muawiyah's rule, or the Caliphate, the early Caliphate, as the golden age of Islam. Yet here we are discussing the fundamental undermining of the prophetic sunnah, or the prophetic vision, perhaps, of economy and the way it should be used, which is quite astounding, really. And we will revisit it again. But in practical terms, this effectively made the rich become richer. It turned Arabs into aristocrats. It turned people away from those values which the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his holy family were trying to promote, which was much more egalitarian and much more based on equality and equal opportunity. And it seems shocking to me that today even Muslim historians will try to paint a picture of that period as being some sort of perfect evolution of Islam or Islamic values. So Muawiyah is in the center of all this, taking the benefit, reaping the rewards of this kind of unfair mechanism, of this huge amount of wealth that they've got now in their hands from the empire. And he's got, for instance, Imam Ali al-Islam coming back on the show because there's no other choice. There's so much chaos as a result of Hazrat Uthman's nepotism, largely. Nepotistic policies, favouring his family over others in high position, led ultimately to the empire being a plundering box for the Bani Umayyah mainly. So, of course, it's going to be hugely difficult for somebody to take the spoon out of somebody's mouth. Muawiyah had that spoon in his mouth for 20 years, and Imam Ali al-Islam is faced with a man who now has independent wealth, independent loyalty, possibly more powerful than the central caliphate itself. He's left with the only force which can perhaps support him, which is the Persian-orientated force out in Kufa. And that's the next part of the world that I'm going to investigate with you in our next program, perhaps to look at Kufa and its viability along with Medina and Mecca as basis for the re-establishment of prophetic visions around economics, around politics, around culture and manners, and whether there was a viable springboard at all left for Imam Ali al-Islam by the time he comes back into power, or was it that Muawiyah was so far in the lead now in terms of economic power and political power that it was going to be impossible for any man to be able to change the course. We're going to revisit that question in the next part of our Timelines series.